Well, again, good morning. I'd like to, at this time, introduce our speaker. He's traveled a long way to join us. In fact, he's come all the way from Israel. He goes by the name of Eliezer. And he was actually a manservant for King David. And we're lucky enough to get him to come here and speak with us today and tell us a story from David's life. Thank you for having me here today. I was asked to come and share, as was said, a story from David's life. You know his backstory, of course, that he grew up the youngest of 7 brothers, and outside the village of Bethlehem, he became famous from this little incident you might have heard of where he killed a giant with a stone and a slingshot. If you haven't heard it, talk to me. I would love to tell you the story. He was also served in the royal and under King Saul. And as he served under King Saul, he became best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan, and he married Saul's daughter, Michal. And so he was very close with the family, and yet at the same time, everybody loved David. Everybody, the whole country loved David. They thought he was like the greatest thing. And unfortunately, that didn't go well with King Saul, who looked down on it and said, wait a minute, I'm the king, I'm supposed to be getting this. So he started to not like David a lot, and so eventually he wanted to kill David. And so David had to run. And so David ran, and he found places to shelter, and sometimes it was in other countries. And one of these other countries was Ammon, where he found protection from King Nahash, who was an enemy of David's, of Saul's, and therefore became a friend of David's. And so later on, when David would become king, he and King Nahash had a good relationship because of this background. And so this is where our story begins. You see, King Nahash died. And I remember David, he was very sad at this event, at the realization that his friend had died, and he wanted to send his sympathies to Hanun, the son, who was now king. And so he said, I'm going to send a delegation. And so he sent this delegation off. And unfortunately, Hanun took the advice of his new advisors, which was a mistake. They said, no, David's not coming here because he wants to check out the city. He wants to come into the city, and then he's going to see where all the weaknesses are so he can attack. And Hanun said, well, I'm the new king. I can't let that happen. And so he captured the men, and he utterly humiliated them. And so as a result, we ended out in a war between Israel and Ammon. Because of this simple mistake, this tragic war began. So a year later, the war had been raging on. It had been going, and it was now spring, and David decided, I'm going to send some more men out to fight in the war. And he sends his main general, Joab. But you see, David, this doesn't make a lot of sense. David is the great warrior king. He killed a giant, for crying out loud. He killed tens of thousands, they said. And it was unheard of that a king wouldn't lead his people into war. But David chose to stay home and send his general, Joab. Don't get me wrong, Joab was a brilliant general. But for the king to not go was just unthinkable. The king's place was at battle. But David stayed back, and I don't really know why. He wasn't ill or anything, and he didn't have any big domestic issues he had to deal with. Maybe it was the fact that they were warring against the son of one of his oldest allies. I don't know. Maybe he couldn't get past that. You know, I probably knew David and his schedule better than anybody, but I can't tell you why he didn't go. What I do know is the simple decision to not go would lead to tragic events. One evening, David decided to take a walk on the roof. And this wasn't unusual. The roof was it was like a garden. It was an area where he could go and he could walk and he could be away and be with his thoughts. And so he was walking around on the roof, taking a look at things. And I remember he'd been up there for about a half an hour when he summoned me. So I went to talk to him to see what he wanted. And as I approached, there was something different on his face. He looked, I don't know, anxious or excited. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. He said, "Eliezer, come here." I walked toward him, but he said, he's like, hurry, come here. So I got up and I stood by him. He said, "I just saw the most beautiful woman." I thought, we're on a rooftop. Where did you see the most beautiful woman? But he leans in and he puts his arm around me. And he points down to this house down below. He says, right there outside that house, right in that garden area, I saw her. She was bathing. The most beautiful woman I've ever seen. I need you to find out who she is. Not that odd of a request. Many kings had multiple wives and when they would see someone beautiful. So I said, sure, I'll find out who she is. So I went and I did some questioning and I asked, and eventually I found out who she was. But this was a problem. You see, it turns out that not only was she already married, she was actually part of a significant family, and her husband was a godly immigrant who served David in his military, named Uriah. So I had to bring this news to David. So as I came to David, I entered his presence, and he said, come here. He said, "What'd you find out?" I stared at him for what seemed an eternity. I didn't know how I was going to tell him that there was nothing he could do. He said, "Who is she?" So finally I said, "She's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." And as these words came out of my mouth, I know I just looked to the ground because I didn't want to see David's heart break because he couldn't have her. To my shock, I heard him say, "Go get her and bring her back to me." I shook my head. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, what was he saying? This was a married woman, a woman whose family served him faithfully. And David was this honorable, this great king. This made no sense to me. How could this be happening? I wanted to tell him, no, I can't do that. I wanted to point out the situation. You know, we could have avoided this whole thing if you'd gone to war, but I couldn't do that. He was my king, and my job was to serve my king. As I thought about this, he said, "Go." And so I went. And the tragedy was set in motion. As I approached her house, I felt the knot in my stomach, but I continued. I knocked on her door, and I waited for her. As she opened the door, I saw that what David was talking about, she really was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. But I told her that the king had requested her presence. She seemed a little confused. Why would the king ask her presence? But it was the king, and so she came. After returning to the palace, the last thing I remember was David closing the door behind them as he spoke to her. I stayed outside the door for several hours. In the middle of the night, I heard the door open. And David saw me there, and he asked me to escort Bathsheba home. I agreed, and we traveled the distance in silence. It was over. Maybe now we could move on and forget that this ever happened. But that wasn't going to be the case. About a month later, I received a notice from Bathsheba that she wanted me to stop by her house. I wondered, why is this suddenly turning up? We haven't heard from her for a month. Why does she want me to stop by? But I went. When I arrived at her house, she greeted me, and I could see that it appeared she had been crying. But she didn't say anything. All she did was hand me a letter and said, "Please deliver this to King David." When I got back to the palace, I went to the king and I gave him the letter. As he began to read it, I saw his face fall. There it was, the same look that I had just seen on Bathsheba's face. David didn't say anything, but I knew what was going on. There was no hiding it. Bathsheba was pregnant, and the timing left no doubt that David was the father. David had given in to a simple temptation, and now the tragic repercussions continued to grow. David quickly moved to his desk and began to write something. As he was writing, he said, "I need you to bring a message. Bring me a messenger who can take this letter to Joab. I need him to send me Uriah so I can talk to him." Well, the battle was about 40 miles away, so it took 2 or 3 days for the messenger to get there and get back. And when he arrived with Uriah, it was really uncomfortable for me, but I realized at least David was going to talk to him. Everything was going to be made right. It was all going to be done with now. David asked Uriah how the battle was going, how the soldiers were faring, how was Joab doing as a general. And this makes sense. You don't jump into the type of conversation David had to have out of nothing. I tried to leave, but David glanced in my direction as if to say, "I need you to stay." So I did. To my surprise, rather than telling Uriah what had happened, he told Uriah, "Well, thank you for the report. I really needed to get an update." Then he paused and he thought for a second. He said, "You know what? You're here. You're back in Jerusalem. Why don't you go home, have a nice meal, have a romantic evening with your wife, and tomorrow you can go back to the battle." And he asked me to escort Uriah to the door to send him on his way. As I walked with Uriah, I thought, why didn't he tell Uriah the truth? He could have ended this right here, but instead he chose to attempt to deceive Uriah. He wants Uriah to sleep with his wife, and I know what's going on. He wants him to think that Uriah to think the child's his. The situation's getting worse. It's not getting better. But there was a problem with David's plan that he hadn't anticipated. You see, Uriah was a man of honor. It was typical for soldiers preparing for war to abstain. And Uriah felt that if the rest of the soldiers were still out there and everything else, this war was going on, it wasn't right for him to come and spend the night with his wife. And so instead, he chose to sleep at the gate of the palace. The next morning, I saw Uriah there sleeping at the gate. And I had to tell David that Uriah had never gone home. I could see the anger welled up in his eyes. He asked me to bring Uriah to him and asked him, "Why didn't you go home?" And Uriah explained what he was thinking. This left David with another dilemma. What am I going to do if this isn't going to happen? So he kept talking with Uriah, and he asked for some drink to be brought, some strong drink, some alcohol. And so we brought it, and they drank, and they talked, and they drank, and they talked, and eventually it was clear that Uriah was becoming intoxicated. And so David had another plan. Now that he's drunk, he'll go sleep with his wife and not realize what he's done. And so he sends him off. Guess what I found the next morning? You got it. There was Uriah sleeping at the gate. It seemed every step that David took only dug the hole deeper and deeper, and there was no response that he expected. When I told David, he was furious. He yelled, "I've tried to fix this, but each time Uriah's honor has gotten in the way. I've only got one more option." And he started writing something at his desk. As he wrote, he spoke almost as if he forgot I was there. He's like, "I'll take care of this once and for all. I'll tell Joab to put Uriah right at the front of the heaviest part of the battle, and then Joab will pull everybody else back, leaving Uriah there alone. He won't last long." As he finished writing, he sealed the letter and told me to give it to Uriah and tell him it was a confidential message for Joab. Against my better judgment, I gave it to Uriah. After all, I was a servant. and told him exactly what David had said, to give it to Joab, that it was confidential. How did we come to this? A simple decision to stay behind instead of going to war. A simple curiosity about a beautiful woman. Then a decision to sleep with a married woman. Then a decision to have her husband killed. Just to cover up his sin. It just made it worse to realize that not only he had sent Uriah with his own death sentence to the front. Well, it was a few days later that the message came, and that it was finished. Uriah was dead. Well, now there was only one thing left for David to do to cover up his crime, and there was no time to spare, because Bathsheba was at least 5 or 6 weeks pregnant at this time. But he still had to wait another month, because to mourn a spouse, it took 30 days for the proper time. So when that 30 days was up, they were married. And not a moment too soon, because it soon became obvious to everybody that she was pregnant. 7.5 months later, give or take, a child was born, a son. So the story comes to an end. David got away with it. He shirked his duty as king. He committed adultery. He had lied, conspired, and orchestrated the murder of a righteous man. And now he had the woman, a son, and only those directly involved knew the truth. Yeah, it looked like he'd committed the perfect crime. Yet the realization was that these tragic sins were the result of succumbing to a simple temptation. Because he had given in to that temptation, all of this had happened. It was eating me up inside, but I was sworn to secrecy to protect the king. But the feeling wouldn't last long, you see. This isn't the end of the story. There is no perfect crime. It was shortly after their son was born that Nathan came to see David. Nathan was a prophet, and it wasn't unusual for prophets to visit kings. Now, sometimes they came with good news. More often than not, they seemed to come with bad news. It should have been obvious which one he was bringing at this point. But he came and asked to see David, and David said, bring him in. I'll let me hear what he has to say. And so I brought Nathan in to see David. He said that he had a message, and as he said it, he glanced in my direction, and David said, no, don't worry, that's my manservant Eliezer. He keeps all my secrets. He's fine over there. And so I stayed in the background, and I heard the message that Nathan had brought. He told a story of two men, a rich man and a poor man. A rich man who had sheep and cattle and everything, and a poor man who had nothing. But he bought a young ewe lamb that he raised with his children, that he cared for with his own hands, and it was as though it was one of his own children. Well, one day, he says, a visitor came to the rich man, and the rich man wanted to feed the visitor, but I'm not going to kill one of mine. He took the ewe lamb from the poor man and served it to his visitor. Nathan asked David, what do you think should happen to somebody like that? David was just infuriated as he heard this story. He said, the man should die. With somber yet stern face, Nathan looked at David and said, this man is you. With these words, David fell to his knees and cried out to God, declaring, I have sinned. As David cried, Nathan continued telling him that God had given him everything. He had made him his anointed king over Israel. He gave him everything that had belonged to Saul. And if that weren't enough, God would have given him even more. But David had sinned against God and taken what was not his. He had ordered the death of Uriah. And as a result, Nathan told David that his family would be devastated. And what is more, the son would die. When we finished speaking, Nathan left when he finished, There David was, laying on the floor, crying. What was he going to do? All of this was his fault. He knew it was the tragic result of his simple decisions he had made. If he had done the right thing and gone to war as kings do, he would never have seen Bathsheba. But he did. Had he not had her brought to the castle, she would never have become pregnant. But she did. Had he come clean to Uriah and told the truth, Uriah would still be alive. But he wasn't. Instead, starting with a simple temptation, things had gotten worse and worse. And now he had been told that the final repercussions of his sin would result in devastating his family and the death of his newborn son. It was a few days later that the news came. David and Bathsheba's son was gravely sick, and David began to cry out to God for his mercy. He stopped eating. He wouldn't bathe. He wore old, ragged clothes. We were afraid, as the servants were afraid he was going to die, and then it happened. The child died, and we were afraid to tell David, because what would happen? Surely he would die if he was grieved that much at his being sick. But the opposite happened. When we told him the news, he bathed, he dressed, and he ate. We asked him why. He said he'd hoped that while the child was sick, his cries would have changed things. But now it's done. His son is gone. So here we are at the actual end. The truth is out. There's no hiding. And it is here that things began to change. You see, God did forgive David because he was truly repentant of his sins. David began to put his life together. He and Bathsheba had other children, including Solomon, who would inherit the throne from David. The war continued, and David took his rightful place, leading the army to victory, claiming the crown of Ammon. It's shocking the way such simple decisions lead to such great sin as the snowball rolls out of control. Had David been faithful to his duty from the beginning, none of this would have happened, and the victory over Ammon may have come so much sooner. Instead, the war drug out for years. David committed adultery. Both an innocent man and a child were dead, and time would reveal the devastation that would come to David's family. Well, Eliezer, of course, is a fictional character. He's a summary of different servants found within the story of Bathsheba and David. And if you want to look more closely at it, it's found in 2 Samuel chapters 10, 11, and 12. But he gives us an insight into the events. That having opened a door to a simple temptation, David walked headlong into tragic sins. The fact is that we are no different. When we fail and stand guard against temptation, we will find ourselves all too often falling into sin. Probably not at the level that David did, but again and again, David surely never intended to end out where he did. Despite these events, the Bible calls David a man after God's own heart. And he's included in the list of heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. In fact, the author of Hebrews then continues in chapter 12 with this challenge to avoid the perils that David faced when he says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." None of us is exempt from temptation, and all of us are susceptible to falling into sin. The most tragic of sins begins with the simplest temptation. For those of us who've placed our faith in Jesus Christ, we know that we are forgiven, and that the Spirit now dwells within us to strengthen us, to resist these temptations, and to guide us to repentance when we do sin. For those of you who have not placed your faith in Jesus Christ, you know that he is waiting, that he desires to forgive and to welcome those who confess their sins. It's only through this strength that we can be found, that the strength that can be found in him, that any of us can hope to throw off the sin which so easily entangles. Let's pray.